Hey, it's Mike, and we are continuing our series in the story of God. We've covered a good chunk of Genesis so far. We've looked at the creation of the universe and then the fall of humanity after they have disobeyed God. And then last week we looked at Abraham and this rescue mission that God is looking to put into place. And today we are looking at the stories of Isaac and of Jacob. Abraham's long-awaited son through his wife Sarah has finally arrived. For 25 years they've gone through this roller coaster of hope and despair until finally the promised heir came. We see Abraham's growth in faith after Isaac is born. When Isaac is a little older, God decides to see if Abraham will still hold fast to his faith in God, even though God has blessed him with so much and the long promised heir has finally come. And so he comes to Abraham and tells him to take his son to this mountain that he will show him in the region of Moriah, and there sacrifice his only son. So Abraham gets a few servants, he grabs his son Isaac, and he heads up on this 3-day journey to the mountain that God had shown him. As they get to the foot of this mountain, he tells the servants to wait by the donkeys and loads up Isaac with wood. And they went up and offered a sacrifice to God. As they were traveling up the mountain, Isaac looked up to his father Abraham and says, "Father, we have the wood here to build the altar and to set the fire, but where is the lamb for the offering?" And Abraham looks down at his son and says, "The Lord will provide the offering for us." And so they get to the place that God had told Abraham to go, and they build an altar there. And then once the altar is finished, Abraham grabs his son Isaac and binds him and puts him on top of the altar. He grabs a knife from his belt and raises it up in the air to bring it down upon his son Isaac when God calls to him from heaven, "Abraham, stop. Don't lay a hand on the child. Now I know for sure that you won't hold anything back from me, not even your son." As Abraham looked up, he saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket, and he took it and he replaced Isaac with it upon the altar, and they sacrificed it to God in Isaac's stead. Now Abraham's time was coming to an end, and he wanted to make sure that Isaac did not return to his previous homeland, and that he did not marry one of the Canaanites in the land that they were dwelling. And so he sent one of his servants to his brother's household to find a wife for Isaac. Marrying cousins was a common practice during these days. The servant was guided by God to a woman named Rebekah, a granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. She returned with this servant and ends up marrying Isaac. And then Abraham dies at the good old age of 175. Now Isaac and Rebekah were married when Isaac was 40 years old, and they too were having troubles getting pregnant. And Isaac prayed to God for his wife, and she became pregnant. No long time waiting for them. But within her there was lots of movement and jostling. She prayed to God to find out what was occurring within her, and God answered her. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. When Rebekah gave birth, she did so to twins. The firstborn was covered in red hair, and so was named Esau, which means hairy. And the secondborn was born right after, grasping to the heel of Esau, and so he was named Jacob, which means he grasps the heel. Isaac was 6 years old when the twins were born. In time, the twins both grow up, and Esau becomes a good hunter and loved being out in the open country. Meanwhile, Jacob was a homebody, and he preferred to live within the camp amongst the tents. Isaac loved himself some wild game, and so Esau became his favorite child. Jacob was a mama's boy, and so became a favorite of his mother Rebekah. Esau returned one day from his hunting, while Jacob was making a red lentil stew. Esau was famished, and the smell of the delicious stew caused him to salivate. "Give me some of the stew you are making, for I am starving." Jacob replied, "I will give you some of the stew if you trade me your birthright for it." Esau, being ever so dramatic, said, "What good is my birthright if I starve to death?" And so Esau didn't value his birthright as the firstborn, and he sold it to Jacob for some lentil stew. And therefore everything that Abraham owned passed down to Jacob. Meanwhile, Isaac had an encounter with a familiar king. When Abraham was living in the area, he feared Abimelech in the same way he had feared the Egyptians when he was in Egypt. He was afraid that he would be killed, and so they would take the beautiful Sarah as their wife. So he lied and said that Sarah was his sister again, and Abimelech took her into his household, but received a dream from God that told him that if he did not return Sarah back to Abraham, a curse would fall upon him. Now fast forward, and Isaac is living in the same land, and he grows afraid that he will be killed because Rebekah is so beautiful. So he goes to the old proven family trick of claiming that Rebekah is his sister. But one day Abimelech is looking out a window and he sees Isaac getting all cuddly and caressing his sister, Rebekah. So Abimelech has Isaac brought to him and says, "Rebekah is your wife. Why would you say she is your sister? Someone could have taken her for their own wife and you would have brought a curse down upon us." Abimelech makes a decree that anyone who harmed Isaac or Rebekah would be put to death. Now, a famine came during this time as well, but instead of going to Egypt like his father Abraham did, God came to Isaac and told him to stay in the land that he was at. And so Isaac obeyed and listened, and despite this famine that was going on, his crops actually grew very well, and he started to grow rich off of this. He grew so rich that the Philistines, the people that Abimelech was king over, began to grow jealous and feared the power that Isaac was getting. And so Abimelech asks Isaac to move away from them, but they make a treaty in promising to treat each other well. And so Isaac moves away from within the Philistine cities and out into the area of Beersheba where he settles. As Isaac aged, his eyesight began to go, and he felt as if his time was coming to an end. He called Esau to him and said, "I am an old man, and I may not be here for much longer. Go hunt some wild game, prepare it in the way that I like, and bring it to me as a meal, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." Rebekah was listening in on this conversation, and when she saw Esau go grab his bow and leave to go hunt, she hurried to her son Jacob. She said, "Your father has sent Esau to go hunting to make him a meal so he can give him his blessing. Quick, go out to our flocks, grab 2 choice lambs and bring them to me, and I will prepare them in the way that your father likes, and then you can go and take him the meal and get his blessing." But Jacob was skeptical about this plan. He said, "What happens if I go in and my father touches me and he realizes that I'm not hairy like my brother Esau? He'll think that I'm trying to trick him, and therefore a curse will come down on me instead of a blessing." But Rebekah tells him not to worry about that, if the curse comes upon him, to let the curse fall on her instead, and to just go and listen to her. So Jacob goes out and he gets the 2 choice lambs. Rachel prepares it in a meal just the way that Isaac likes. She takes some of the wool and puts it on the back of Jacob's hands and on the back of his neck and sends him in to his father. As Jacob comes to his father, Isaac asks, "Who is it?" "It's your son, Esau. I have brought you some of my wild game to eat." Isaac was skeptical. "How did you find it so quickly?" "The Lord your God gave me great success," Jacob replied. "Come here so I can touch you," Isaac asked, and Jacob drew near, and Isaac placed his hands on Jacob. The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are hairy like Esau's, Isaac thought to himself. "Are you really my son Esau?" "I am." "Then bring me some of the game you have hunted." Isaac ate the meal and drank the wine that Jacob had brought. And when he had finished, he brought Jacob near and kissed him. And as he did, he caught a smell of the clothes that he was wearing, Esau's finest clothes that Rebekah had put on Jacob. And with that, he blessed him and said, "Ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of the open field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." After receiving the blessing, Isaac slipped out of the room, and very shortly after, Esau entered in with the meal he prepared. "Father, sit up and eat of this game that I have gotten for you, so that I may receive your blessing." "Who is this?" Isaac asked. "It's your firstborn, Esau." Isaac trembled in anger. "If this is Esau, then who brought me hunted game, fed it to me, and to whom I gave my blessing?" Esau gave a mournful cry and pleaded with his father, bless me as well." But Isaac told him that Jacob had tricked him and stole Esau's blessing. "Ugh, Jacob is an apt name for him," Esau bemoaned, "since he who grasps at a heel is a euphemism for he who deceives in Hebrew. He has tricked me out of both my birthright and my blessing. Please, Father, you must surely have some sort of blessing for me." But Isaac had made Jacob lord over Esau, blessed him with an abundance of grain and wine, and so there was no blessing left for Esau. Esau was distressed and angry. He muttered to himself that once his father died, he would kill his brother Jacob. But Rebekah once again was listening and overheard Esau's vengeful mutterings, and she sent Jacob away to her brother's household back where she was from. Once Esau calmed down, she would send for Jacob to return. She also made Jacob swear not to marry a Canaanite, but to find a wife from her brother's household. So Jacob returns to Isaac, who gives him another blessing, and then he flees out of Canaan. As he was on the border of the land of Canaan, about to cross over, he lay down to sleep, and he had a dream. He saw a stairway rising up into the heavens, and angels were moving up and down it. God stood at the top of the stairway and said to Jacob, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants this land on which you stand. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. All people on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Wherever you go, I will be with you and will watch over you until you return back to this land." Jacob awoke and realized that God was in that place that he had slept, and he did not even realize it. Jacob arrives in the land of his mother and runs into Rachel, the daughter of Laban, Rebekah's brother. And he falls in love with her and knows that she was the one who he wanted to be his wife. Rachel brought him to her father Laban, who greeted him with a big hug and brought him into his home. Jacob stayed with Laban for a month, tending his herd. But after that month's time, Laban felt that it was wrong that Jacob was working for no pay. So Jacob made him a deal. He would continue to work for Laban for 7 years, tending his flock of sheep in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage at the end of those 7 years. Laban agreed, and Jacob worked for 7 years for him. But it just seemed like a few days for him, such was his love for Rachel. When the 7 years were up, they had a feast to celebrate. Much food and much wine was drank, and Jacob went to his tent. But instead of Rachel entering the tent, Laban sent his older daughter, Leah, in to Jacob, and he slept with her. When Jacob awoke in the morning and saw that it was Leah and not Rachel next to him, he went to Laban and demanded to know why he had been deceived. "It is not custom to marry the younger before the older," Laban replied. "Work for me another 7 years, and I will give you Rachel's hand as well." So Jacob worked for another 7 years for his uncle Laban, and by the end of it, he was given Rachel in marriage as well. But there was much strife between Leah and Rachel. Jacob loved Rachel, but he didn't love Leah, and Leah grew sad about that. God saw Leah's pain and so allowed her to have a child. In fact, she had 4. Rachel was unable to conceive and grew jealous of her sister, so she gave Jacob her servant Bilhah. who had 2 sons. Leah had stopped having children, but saw that Rachel's servant was bearing Jacob's sons, and so gave her servant Zilpah to Jacob, who bore Jacob 2 more sons. And then in a deal over some mandrakes between Leah and Rachel, Leah was able to go to bed with Jacob, where she conceived and gave birth to another son, and then another son shortly after. Now, Rachel was very distressed over this, for she had had no children. God heard her cry, and Rachel gave birth to 2 sons. One much later on. So in the end, we see this nation really starting to take form. We had Abraham with just the 1 son. Then Isaac has 2 sons, but Jacob is the one to whom the blessing is given. And now we see Jacob has 12 sons. Leah births Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Rachel's servant Bilhah gives birth to Dan and Naphtali. Leah's servant gave birth to Gad and Asher. And finally, Rachel gives birth to Joseph, and then much later on to Benjamin. All these sons, except for Benjamin, were born while Jacob was still working for Laban. But Jacob knew that it was time for him to return to his homeland. But Laban did not want Jacob to leave, because he knew that God had blessed Laban with great wealth because of Jacob. Laban was being blessed because he was blessing Jacob, in a way. He told Jacob that he would pay him whatever he wanted to keep him there tending his flocks. So Jacob made a deal with him that Jacob would receive all the sheep that were spotted or flecked as his own, and all the straight-colored sheep would be Laban's. The deal was agreed, and Jacob picked out all the spotted and flecked sheep as his own, and tended to both flocks. Now when the sheep bred, they always did so in front of the watering hole. So Jacob would watch, and when the strong and healthy females and males would breed together, he would put spotted branches in the water. And whenever the weak and sickly females and males would breed together, he would take the branches out of the water. And so somehow through this, those who bred in front of the branches gave birth to spotted and flecked sheep, and those who did not gave birth to straight-colored sheep. And so Jacob ended up having all the strong, healthy sheep in his flock, while Laban's flock grew weaker and sickly. Well, one day Jacob overhears Laban's sons grumbling over Jacob about how he had stolen everything from their father Laban. And he also noticed that Laban himself had started treating him with less favor. God then came to Jacob and said, "Go back to the land of your fathers and your relatives, and I will be with you." So Jacob grabbed his family and his flocks and fled from Laban's home back towards his homeland. But Rachel had stolen her father's household gods and hid them in her saddlebag. And it was 3 days after Jacob had left that Laban had noticed that Jacob, his daughters, his grandchildren, and his household gods were all gone. And so he set off in pursuit of Jacob and eventually overtook him 3 days later while they were setting up camp. "You have left me to go back to your father's household by sneaking off. You have prevented me from sending you off with music, from kissing my daughters and my grandchildren goodbye, and to top it all off, you insulted me by stealing my household gods." Well, Jacob took offense at that last part. "I did not steal your household gods." He didn't know that Rachel had. "Search the bags, and if you find them, then take them and go. But I did not steal them." So Laban searched the tents, and when he came into Rachel's tent, Rachel was sitting on the bag in which she had put the gods. When he came in, she said, "Excuse me for not standing in my Lord's presence, but I'm on my period." So Laban searched the room without going near Rachel, and he could not find his household gods. But he kissed his daughters and his grandchildren and said goodbye and returned back home. So Jacob, as he drew nearer and nearer to home, he grew more and more anxious. He was afraid now of how Esau would react to his return. He came to the border of the land and decided to send messengers to Esau to let him know about his return. He instructed the messengers to say to Esau, "Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with our uncle Laban and have remained there until now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my lord that I may find favor in your eyes." The messengers went, delivered the message, and when they returned, they brought a report back to Jacob that Esau was coming to meet him, accompanied by 400 men. Jacob grew very afraid. He thought Esau was coming with an army to destroy him and everything that he had, and so he prayed to God. He then came up with a plan. That night he decided to set up in 2 camps and split his family between these 2 camps. That way in the night, if Esau came and attacked one camp, at least the other camp could flee and get to safety, and therefore he wouldn't lose all of his family. He then split everything that he had into 3 groups and sent them ahead towards Esau. And he gave each of the groups this message when Esau was approached them. They were to say, "These belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us." Jacob stayed on the other side of the river as his family camped in the 2 camps. And that night a man came to him, and they wrestled against each other all night long until the sun began to rise. Jacob was clutching to the man, and the man saw he could not overpower Jacob in this match, and so the man reached out and touched Jacob's hip, dislocating it. Jacob fell, but continued to hold fast to the man. "Let me go, for the sun is rising," the man said to him. "I will not let you go until you bless me," Jacob replied. "What is your name?" "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans, and have overcome." With that the man left, and Jacob called the place Peniel, which means face of God. For he said, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Jacob crossed over the river in the morning and saw Esau and his men awaiting him. So Jacob gathered his family and went to Esau, Jacob going ahead of the family. And Esau ran up and embraced his brother. "Who are these that are with you, my brother?" Esau asked. "They are the wives and children the Lord has blessed me with." And the female servants came with their children, and they bowed before Esau. Then Leah and her children approached and bowed before Esau. And then Rachel and Joseph came and bowed before Esau. "And what is the meaning of all these flocks and herds that I have encountered on my way here?" Esau asked. "They are a gift to find favor in your eyes." "I have plenty. Keep them for yourself," Esau insisted. But Jacob insisted even harder. Esau then offered to escort Jacob further into the land, but Jacob, worried that at some point Esau might turn and attack him, said that the little ones were tired from the journey and he didn't want to slow Esau down in his return home. So eventually, after this tense meeting of the brothers, they parted. And so God brought Jacob safely back into the land that he had promised him. A lot happens in Jacob's story. A whole series could easily be done with this story, so we won't get as super deep into it as we could. But we see Jacob as a man who fights and struggles for everything he can get his hands on. He starts as the underdog, the second-born and homebody compared to the rugged and tough firstborn Esau. But he manipulates and deceives his brother to get his birthright, and then manipulates and deceives his father in order to get the blessing that's meant for Esau. This causes great conflict between them, to the point where he has to flee. And then the deceiver gets deceived by his uncle Laban, tricked into marrying Leah instead of his love Rachel, and thus Laban gets another 7 years of labor out of him. Then Jacob manipulates Laban by using some weird way with branches to get the best of the flock to be his own. And this deception and manipulation causes him again to have to flee from where he is to a new place. And the climax of his story comes in the struggle with God before returning back into the promised land of Canaan. He grasps and clings to God in a night-long struggle to receive a blessing, and his name is changed to Israel, which means he struggles with God. Jacob's wrestling with God is the summary of his life, as he deceives and manipulates his ways into getting God's promises and seeing it become a reality for himself. Jacob isn't willing to wait and trust in God's faithfulness like Abraham was. It was told to Rebekah that the older Esau would serve the younger Jacob, but Jacob did all that he could to ensure that that would happen, and did so by his and his mother's own effort. His deception of Esau and Isaac caused his brother to want to kill him and his father to be quite angry with him and forced him to leave the land. His manipulation catches up to him as Laban deceives him, and then his manipulation of Laban causes him to again have to flee back to where he comes from. And this is where God sees that Jacob decides to struggle and wrestle with others to get what he wants, so God comes and engages him on his own level. He comes down and he wrestles and he struggles with Jacob until Jacob ends up with a dislocated hip that will cause him to limp for the rest of his life. But Jacob receives the blessing from God and begins to change his ways. He becomes generous with his brother Esau, sending him many gifts to appease him, to hope that Esau won't kill him. But he goes over the top with it and just gives him so much wealth and riches, generous with what he has. We also see before he struggles with God, the first time that he comes and he prays to God, he asks for help from God. He starts changing his ways away from the deceiver and the manipulator that seeks to work things so that they will happen in his own way, and trust God by praying to God to spare him from his brother's wrath. And then he comes and he wrestles with God. And this encounter of fighting and wrestling and clinging and seeking God transforms Jacob. And when we engage with God and seek him, cling to him, often wrestle and we struggle with him, we come out transformed into new people. People that God desires us to be. So we see Jacob is in the land and has been transformed into a man of God. But his life of deception and manipulation still has effects of conflict in his life and in his family life, as we see in our story next week.